Honoured guests, alumni, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this particular session in Melbourne University's Festival of Ideas on food fights and food security. My name is Graham Mitchell. I'm your chairman this afternoon. Before we get into things, I would just like to remind you of three things. The first is that the session, including the Q&A, questions and answers at the end of our session, they're being filmed and audio recorded. Secondly, to remind you, if you've not already done it, to turn off your mobile phones, much appreciated. And then thirdly, a little bit about the format. What we will do, we'll have three 15 to 20 minute presentations, then a little discussion, a dialogue amongst the panel when they've heard what each other's said, leaving half an hour, if not more, for discussion. And I think the size of the audience bespeaks the interest in this particular topic. And so there will be a vigorous question and answer. We must leave plenty of time for that. So as our panellists, we have very fortunate to have three eminent speakers, three genuine ideas people, all professors of the University of Melbourne: Janet Macalmon, Snow Barlow and Tim Reeves. Now, those of you who have been following the climate change debate will, I suggest, have not yet heard a lot or seen a lot of coverage on what some of us believe is a very major looming threat to human well-being, social order and world peace, namely food security. If you go out and survey people and say, what is the most important thing for you day by day, and say, don't answer now, come back in 2 weeks and answer that question, you will see a very high proportion of people will say an assured supply of safe food. So food is obviously important to us. And we'll hear from our panellists some of the pretty stark arithmetic around this issue of global food security, certain figures, trends and data sets which provide a very clear wake-up call. So it's a very timely symposium, and I congratulate the organisers of the Festival of Ideas of picking this particular one, and especially the three people who are going to be talking to us about that problem. And you'll also hear from those panellists of some options to address and solve these particular issues swirling around food security. We do pride ourselves, as you know, as being the clever species on this earth. And we've had wicked problems. We've confronted them in the past. What can we do about this one? And I think food security, like climate change, is a wicked problem in that it's going to be insidious, it's going to creep up on us, and it will have major implications in this heavily populated world with very finite resources. So we need to prepare ourselves, again using that classic approach of a technological fix plus a major practice change. So without further ado, it's now my pleasure to introduce the first of our panellists. Now, you will have the biographies and CVs of these folk. So with their permission, I will give them short shrift in terms of their eminent credentials and just simply say the first about Professor Janet Macalmon, as best known for 3 prize-winning histories of Melbourne life, as well as a former long-running column in The Age newspaper. She holds a joint appointment in the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences and the Faculty of Arts in this university, and teaches the new interdisciplinary university breadth subject, An Ecological History of Humanity. And Janet, quite appropriately, is going to kick off with a bit of a historical perspective on food production, food supply and the consequences of shortages. Professor Janet Macalmon.
Thank you, Graham. Now, wrong one. To the genius of love and the genius of hunger, Turgenev might well have added the weather. For all species, the purpose of life itself is to find sustenance to be able to reproduce a viable next generation. But climate has always determined where and when that was possible. As Australians, we have perhaps a greater appreciation of the deep prehistory of humanity than people of any continent other than Africa. People have lived in Australia continuously for around 60,000 years, and the demographer Len Smith, who's come today, has calculated that this dry, ancient portion of the earth has supported around 1 billion human lives past infancy, scarcely an unproductive terra nullius. But in much of Europe and all the Americas, continuous human occupation and history go back only to the beginning of the Holocene, 10 to 12,000 years ago. There were up to 7 attempts by humans and their ancestors to colonise Britain, for instance, and each suffered extinction because of extreme climate change. In fact, human history, as opposed to prehistory, can only have said to have begun in the Holocene, and if you look at the record of variability of human temperatures, you can see why. For most of the world, human history is crammed into that relatively short time since the end of the last ice age. This list begins with the domestication of plants and animals, the intensification of food production, the building of complex sedentary societies where the food sources, climate, soils and water made that possible, the expansion of political and economic power into peripheral empires to support the core, and the development of science and technology to conquer space, time and ecological constraints on energy. It is only 9,000 years since the first city, Katahu, in Turkey, 5,000 years since the first great civilizations of the Mediterranean, 1,500 years since the decline of the Roman Empire, 1,000 years since the medieval warm period, 500 years from the beginning of the Columbian Exchange, 200 years since the Aboriginal people of this land lost their freedom and their world. And it's just 200 years since the emergence of the fossil economy that has transformed our lives, both for great good and now increasingly for ill. And for most of our long prehistory and history, the lot of humankind has been hunger. Foragers kept hunger at bay with their encyclopedic knowledge of plants, animals, water and the seasons, but they had to travel light so that they could move with the seasonal flow and ebb of resources. That meant they also had to control the other genius of all living things, love. New babies could only be raised if there was no other child to carry, so that while high infant mortality and infanticide have been a grim constant in our human story, fertility was often managed by extended lactation. But once humans found ways to produce and husband food in one place, rather than simply find it, women's work in field and household made extended breastfeeding more difficult and early weaning much easier. Infant mortality rose, and with higher infant mortality came higher fertility. Human beings now needed to maximise their fertility, to invest, if you like, in redundancy to maintain their numbers. We know from the archaeological evidence that civilisation or complex societies made their inhabitants shorter, sicker, and more often acquainted with death. The normal lot of parents came to be that they buried their children, sometimes nearly all of them. And that did not change even in this country and its heritage societies until the beginning of the 20th century. The history of humanity, therefore, has also been one of a biological contest between love and hunger that has been at the mercy of the weather. It's also been a contest between human groups, not just tribes, states and nations, but even more within groups, between generations and between elites and the masses. Complex food production required human labour, but economies that could produce surpluses found themselves as supporting elites of rulers, priests, bureaucrats and warriors. The control of hunger depended not just on production of food, but critically on the politics of resource distribution in the society. This was a hunger that was dependent not simply on the weather, the ecological conditions of production, but on the social organisation and the society's values. This was a hunger that the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen has identified as entitlement, and in complex societies, an individual's entitlement, either by lineage or status, material wealth, intellectual capital or work determined their share of wealth and therefore sustenance. This too was in a way about love, a different sort of love, social love, the relationships between people and the way they value others. The history of human hunger, therefore, is both ecological and political. But driving it all were the natural systems of the climate. Even the Holocene has experienced variations in climate that have profoundly affected where and how well human communities have been able to live. What's more, the variations over the past 5,000 years have been comparatively small in their range of mean temperature compared to the Pleistocene, and comparatively small compared to the changes in temperature which are now being predicted in our own time. But the effects have been severe. So no matter going back to the historical record and pretending climate variation is normal and benign, it has certainly not been in our recorded history. The world may seem big and robust, but we're coming to appreciate how fragile is the balance between survival and catastrophe, between life and death. The elephant in the room in this history of the Holocene is Eurasia, the home of the handful of mammals and cereal plants that could be domesticated. If history has seemed Eurasia-centric, it is because, in the terms of intensification of human population, it was, until very recent times, the big winner. By the year 1, after 6,000 years of comparative climatic calm, the world's population was distributed thus. This is a morphed map from the Sheffield University Department of Geography. The regions that sustained most human life were China, India and the Mediterranean system of Roman hegemony, including Egypt, Northwest Africa and plus Northwest Africa and the Bantu farmers. These were peoples who had intensified production of cereals, often by irrigation. They had beasts of burden to pull ploughs. They had horses for warfare and roaming the steppes. They had animals for protein and hides. They had ships for trade to bring grain to settlements that could not provide for themselves. Deeper into Europe, the great rivers provided lifelines of trade. Already by this time, the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia had dried out and declined into underpopulation and poverty. On the other hand, the Americas, as you see, were tiny in demographic terms, showing significant human impact only in Mesoamerica and in Peru. If we look at the world's wealth at the beginning of the Christian era, we can see that wealth and population were symbiotically linked. 1,500 years on the eve of the Columbian Exchange of species, 1,500 years later, on the eve of the Columbian exchange of species, natural resources and people across the Atlantic, the distribution of the world's people had changed very little. Humankind was still locked into the Eurasian landmass, and Japan had grown, as had France and Britain. Italy had diminished a little. Northwest Africa had grown, with city-states enriched by trade across the Sahara, and in America the Aztec and Inca empires had produced growth. But North America had not grown proportionately. If you look at the world's wealth at the same time, 1500, you can see that wealth and population size was still interdependent. Some places like Italy, however, enriched by its maritime economy, were wealthy beyond their population size, and as you can see, England was still a midget power. However, there's another map that measures the untapped organic potential of the world, that of current biocapacity, and that includes cropland, pasture, forests and fisheries. 16% of the world's biocapacity is in Brazil. But a huge proportion of it, equal to China's and Europe and greater than India's, is just in the United States alone. Biocapacity can be read as the potential of the world as an organic economy. Yet in 1500, the vast biocapacity of Americas remained untapped. We now appreciate that this imbalance was not due to the superior cognitive capacity of Eurasian people. It depended entirely on having domesticated animals as beasts of burden and for food and as food and textiles. Farmers with just a hoe, compared to those with a bullock and a plough, produced very much less. They also grew less tall if they had little animal protein to eat, as happened in Mesoamerica and West Africa. Most significant perhaps of all, the Highlanders of New Guinea, who were amongst the world's first farmers 9,000 years ago, remained locked into malnutrition and subsistence living by their lack of rich resources of plant and animal protein from the natural environment, either for forager hunting or cultivation and husbandry. There were whole societies, therefore, that were forever hungry. It was historical geographers and economic historians who began directing attention to the concept of an organic economy. It was powered by solar energy that was transferred via biomass to fire and heat and to the muscles of beasts of burden, slaves, serfs and peasants. Food production and its adequacy to meet the needs of the population is entirely dependent on climate, soil, water and social organisation. Therefore, variations in climate that affected agricultural productivity have always driven the deep history of the world. Likewise, timber, peat and cattle dung were the most important combustible fuels for cooking, heating, metal and woodworking, pottery and brickmaking. Consequently, the availability of trees determined how well a people kept warm and cooked, built houses and boats that might enable them to trade and make up for the deficiencies in their own ecology. If, like the Romans, they had built a society of such density and complexity that the hinterlands could not supply sufficient grain, then they needed the ships to bring that grain from afar. The Roman fleet supplying grain to the Italian peninsula from the granaries of North Africa would not be matched in size until those of 17th century England. The economy of renewable energy might have been ecologically sound, but it was never productive enough to keep up with the demands of human population growth. The first person to really understand that was the Reverend Thomas Malthus, whose essay on population in 1798 argued that while the productivity of the managed natural world could only grow arithmetically, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, the human population, if unchecked by restraints on births or by deaths on mortality crises, grew geometrically, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. What has become known as the Malthusian trap was an economy where human populations were constantly outgrowing their ecologies, and the resulting famines and epidemic diseases so checked population in a so-called positive way. If human beings were not to experience... If human beings were not to experience the misery of losing their children and loved ones too soon, they had to constrain their reproduction, Malthus argued, by sexual restraint. The controversial economic historian Gregory Clark has represented the history of the world caught in the Malthusian trap thus, and you can see at the bottom of the page. The rises and fall represent the fluctuations of the climate from the warm period of the Roman Empire, the cooling that underwrote its decline, the warming from the early to high Middle Ages, where European agricultural productivity funded the glories of Gothic cathedrals, the founding of the universities and the great abbeys, and the astonishing growth in towns after centuries of urban poverty and disease. Europeans, however, were pushing to the boundaries of arable land and consuming the forests. Then the weather turned wet and cold. The crops failed. Famine savaged Europe before the Mongols, fleeing inland droughts of the medieval warming, helped to communicate the Black Death east and west. This was the calamitous 14th century. And after that, the background to the glorious period of human European painting, writing and thought, and to the growth of commerce and industry, was urban affluence and rural decline. Florence, in the 420 years between 1371 and 1791, had only 16 very good harvests, fewer than 4 a century. Indeed, Florence had been dependent on Sicilian grain since the 13th century. Feudalism was an inefficient agricultural system, and Europe's agriculture needed to consolidate holdings and privatise commons for it to begin to produce adequate surpluses. But land consolidation, when it came, left peasants landless and without access to commons, adding to the growing army of vagabonds, beggars and landless people. Towns and cities could import food and timber from elsewhere and build mercantile wealth. But as the hinterlands went into decline, towns found themselves besieged by the hungry and homeless. Put into simplest terms, European agriculture could not generate sufficient calories in food for the masses to power its economy from within its own resources. However, as Europe got colder after 1500, it also got richer. As the Little Ice Age wore on, towns also suffered from the growing shortage of that other staple of the organic economy, timber, particularly for the building of ships that linked seaports to the world system. Europe found the biocapacity, however, to keep pace with the wealth-creating needs of its elites elsewhere. If we look at where the world's wealth lay by 1900, we can see again who were the winners and losers in the 400 years since the Columbian exchange between the New World and the Old across the Atlantic had begun. By 1900, the Americas, in particular the United States, had entered the world story. But the critical impact of the New World was the explosion of wealth in Western Europe, especially in Great Britain, Belgium and France, the decline of the Iberians, the utter depletion of Africa, the shrinking of China and India. The great economic historian of China, Kenneth Pomerantz, has called Europe's enrichment the Great Divergence. His analysis begins with the premise that even as late as the early 19th century, China and India were still on a par with Europe as economic powers. The Great Divergence came from Europe's capacity to draw on timber and biocapacity in the New World, using free labour from Africa, and on coal. First, that biocapacity that created the new wealth from Europe came from the organic economy using human energy from Africa. And the African historian Joseph Inakori has mapped the dire effect of the slave trade on the human and capital and resources of West Africa in particular. Africa was always, until our own time, an underpopulated continent. And Africa's irony and tragedy is that the major export of this chronically underpopulated continent has been in human beings. The Atlantic Triangle saw African human energy transported to the tropical Americas, where at the cost of subsistence only, it converted New World biocapacity into vast financial wealth for West Europeans via sugar, cotton and coffee. That wealth, in turn, provided the British elite with the investment capital that it was available when they took the next critical step, the move to the fossil economy. The Cambridge economic historian Sir Anthony Wrigley has reminded us what Malthus could not anticipate was the impact of the fossil economy. Tapping into carbon trapped and stored in a combustible form during deep historical time enabled humanity to short-circuit geological time. This way, we escape the natural time limits of the organic economy. The transformation of capacity by this new energy was as revolutionary and, of course, much quicker than the capture of animal energy from domestication and forced human labour. Britain could now be rebuilt in brick rather than wood or stone, because no longer did the forests have to be sacrificed to bake the bricks. Likewise, glass and windows now became affordable. With the production of 10,000 tonnes of iron required the felling of 100,000 acres of woodland, there were severe limits on the making of quality iron and steel. The other European country to take this path simultaneously was Belgium, but not the Netherlands, which relied on peat. The puzzle of why China has been the question that's preoccupied many historians since, but essentially to do with their lack of access to the right sort of financial operations. Liberated from the constraints of the organic economy, human population growth was limited now only by disease, institutionalised inequality and violence. The Nobel Prize winner Robert Fogel argues that the most remarkable achievement of the 20th century was the extension of life expectancy, which increased by about 30 years since 1900 in England, France, the United States, and equal or larger amounts elsewhere. The transformation of energy from organic to fossil led to exponential growth in material wealth and technologies that combined with human culture to create what he called techno-physico-evolution. This growth of human population has overwhelmingly, though, been since 1950. But like the Little Ice Age, it has been in cities while the countryside has been reformed and consolidated where possible into agribusinesses. The great subsistence peasant economies of Africa and India are being replaced by modern farming that produces export crops but displaces small farmers. The supply of calories has kept pace with population growth until the present, but a consequence has been the destruction of rural societies in India and Africa, leaving people to seek survival in the great slums of the modern world. Mike Davis has called our world a planet of slums, where now more than half humanity lives in cities, most of them outside Europe, in mega metropolises of misery. Most of all, the fossil economy has enabled us to escape the Malthusian trap, but it is only a temporary escape. The world still has limits to growth if we depend on non-renewables that are finite resources. And as we are now aware, in cheating nature by short-circuiting geological time, we have imported the carbon of the dead past into the living world of the present and the future where it has disturbed our atmospheric equilibrium. We are now paying a fearful price. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Janet. Very thoughtful. Professor Snow Barlow is a plant physiologist and agricultural scientist who has published more than 100 papers in environmental plant biology on plant water use, efficiency, viticulture and impacts of climate change, including elevated CO2 levels on agricultural industries. Snow is the Foundation Professor of Horticulture and Viticulture and Associate Dean in Strategic Relationships at the University of Melbourne. And Snow will outline some of the current challenges in this food security arena and discuss what we've actually got in the science and technology armamentarium, what's in our kit bag to actually address some of these mega issues. Snow Barlow.
Thank you, Graham, and alumni and friends and colleagues. Janet has taken us on a fantastic journey through the history of time, but I'm going to bring you down to earth and remind you that we are, as Homo sapiens, are but one of millions of species on Earth. And our continued survival and our evolution on this Earth will depend on what it all depends on all other species. Basically, can we feed ourselves enough to reproduce? Can we avoid disease? And can we avoid being eaten? Today I'm going to argue that we are sitting on a food security time bomb through a perfect storm of a number of international pressures that are developing. I'm going to argue further that climate change exacerbates this threat to our food security. Then consider, in the more positive way, how we might adapt to that. Do we have any science in the cupboard? Is there ways that we could apply science and technology to this, but in a social context? And finally, finish with a plea to say that our global resources are finite, and any solution that we come to food security inevitably has to be a solution about energy, food and water security. But I want to begin today with a little story that I think gives you a metaphor to think about this in. There was a fantastic story, true of course, out of country Victoria more than a month ago, of a country GP who confronted with an enormous problem. He had a child who'd fallen off a skateboard, hit his head and had all the symptoms of brain hemorrhaging, pressure developing in his cranial cavity. He was at a country hospital. There was no neurosurgeon. There was no possibility of neurosurgery. To put the person on a plane would have been absolute death because of the increased pressure, or decreased pressure, increased pressure in the brain. So what did he do? He used modern technology. He got his mobile phone. He contacted in Melbourne an internationally renowned neurosurgeon. He confirmed the diagnosis. He was given what the treatment was. The treatment was to release the pressure with a surgical drill. There's only a problem: no surgical drill at a country hospital. But he did know Joe the carpenter, and he knew that he had a cordless drill. So he got a cordless drill, but with a mobile phone in one hand, and a cordless drill in the other, adequately sterilised. He relieved the pressure, the boy survived, and survived very healthily. That metaphor is we have an enormous pressure building up on the globe in a sense of people, in a sense of demand for resources. We need to apply the best technology we have available to that. But we need to apply it in a local context, because ultimately that's where the food will be produced.